Imagine planting your fields in spring with every reason to feel hopeful. The frost has finally loosened its grip, the ground is ready, and the seeds are in the earth where they belong. Then June arrives, and it feels nothing like June. The mornings stay sharp and grey, the afternoons refuse to warm. Frost returns in places where frost has no business appearing in midsummer. Farmers walk out to check their crops and find blackened leaves, stunted growth, soil still cold beneath their fingers when it should be radiating heat. Then July comes, and July feels just the same. Something has gone wrong with the world, and nobody quite knows what. That is where our story begins. In 1816, summer simply did not arrive across wide stretches of the Northern Hemisphere. Not really. Not in any way that the people living through it recognized as summer. And the question at the heart of this story is one of the most haunting in all of climate and human history. How does an entire season vanish? How does warmth fail so completely that crops die in New England and Switzerland and China all in the same year? How does a single chain of events pull so tightly that a volcano on one side of the world creates orphans on the other? That chain is what we're going to trace tonight, slowly and carefully. A volcanic eruption of almost incomprehensible scale, a sky that changed, a growing season that collapsed, harvests that came back empty, markets where prices climbed beyond what ordinary people could pay, and communities left trying to make sense of a world that had stopped behaving the way the world was supposed to behave. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Where are you right now, and what time is it where you are? Someone listening to this might be in a cold country, deep into winter already. Someone else might be in a place where the sun barely sets in summer. Someone might be half a world away, beginning their morning. I always look through the comments, and the geography of people drifting off to these stories still surprises me. Tell me where you are. Tonight, we move gently through weather and fear and the strange resilience of ordinary people caught inside an extraordinary catastrophe. There's no need to rush. The story will unfold on its own. To understand why 1816 felt the way it did, you have to go back 14 months earlier. Back to an island in what is now Indonesia, in a part of the world that most people living through the summer famine had never heard of and could not have placed on a map. Mount Tambora sits on the island of Sumbawa, rising out of the ocean with the kind of quiet authority that volcanoes project in the centuries between eruptions. It had been dormant for so long that the people living on its slopes had no memory of it as a dangerous thing. It was simply part of the landscape, a mountain, a backdrop, something that had always been there and would always be there. Then, in April of 1815, it stopped being quiet. The eruption began with smaller events in the days before the main blast, rumblings and ash columns that gave some warning, but not nearly enough. On the evening of April 10th, the mountain tore itself apart. What followed is considered by most volcanologists to be the largest eruption in recorded human history. Not just large in the way that all major eruptions are large. Tambora released an estimated 100 cubic kilometers of material into the surrounding landscape and atmosphere. The sound of the explosion was heard as far away as 2,000 miles. Ash fell across an enormous swath of the region, blanketing everything within hundreds of miles in layers thick enough to collapse rooftops. The eruption column reached into the stratosphere, somewhere in the range of 40 kilometers up, high enough to inject material far above the weather systems that normally cycle air and particles back down to Earth within weeks. On Sumbawa and the surrounding islands, the destruction was immediate and total. The volcanic flows that poured down Tambora's slopes erased entire communities. Tsunamis generated by the eruption travelled outward across the Java Sea and struck coastlines with walls of water that compounded the destruction inland. The kingdom of Tambora, an entire culture centred on that mountain, was gone within hours. Estimates of the immediate death toll vary considerably depending on which historical sources you consult and how carefully those sources were recorded in the first place. But most serious attempts to reconstruct the numbers suggest somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 people died in the direct violence of the eruption itself. In the weeks and months that followed, famine and disease on the affected islands killed tens of thousands more, bringing some estimates of total regional deaths to 70 or even 80,000 people. The confidence we can place in those numbers has limits. This was a remote corner of the world in 1815, and documentation was fragmentary at best. But the eruption's reach did not stop at the shoreline of the Indonesian archipelago. This is where the story becomes something stranger and harder to hold in your mind at once. When Tambora exploded with that kind of force and sent its column that high into the stratosphere, it injected enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide into a layer of atmosphere where weather systems cannot wash it back down quickly. In the lower atmosphere, rain does that work. It scrubs particles out and returns them to Earth within days or weeks. But in the stratosphere, there is no rain. The sulfur dioxide that reached those altitudes reacted with water vapor and formed tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, and those droplets spread. Slowly, carried by high-altitude winds, they dispersed around the planet in a thin, persistent veil. Not a veil that anyone could see clearly from the ground. Not something that would block your view of the sky on any given afternoon. But a veil that filtered incoming sunlight in ways that accumulated. A fraction of a percent less solar energy reaching the surface, day after day, week after week, month after month. What makes this part of the story difficult to absorb is the delay. The eruption happened in April of 1815. The immediate catastrophe in Indonesia was horrific and immediate, but the global atmospheric effects took time to fully develop and spread. The sulfuric acid haze needed months to disperse across the entire upper atmosphere. It needed to reach the latitudes where most of the northern hemisphere's agriculture and population were concentrated. It needed to settle into a stable enough configuration that it could meaningfully reduce the solar energy reaching the ground during an entire growing season. That process wasn't complete in 1815. The summer of 1815 in Europe and North America was unusual in places, with strange sunsets reported and some evidence of cooling, but not catastrophic. The aerosol veil was still forming, still spreading. By 1816, it was ready. The atmospheric conditions that would steal a summer were fully in place across much of the world, courtesy of a volcano most of the affected people had never heard of, on an island most of them could not name. Erupting 14 months earlier in a place so remote that the news of what had happened there arrived slowly, in fragments through trading ships and dispatches that took months to cross the ocean. Scientists today reconstruct all of this through ice cores drilled in Greenland and Antarctica, where layers of sulfuric acid from Tambora are preserved in the ice like a bookmark in time. Through tree rings that show the cold, compressed growth of those years. Through historical records of temperatures and harvests and prices. The broad picture is well established. Some of the finer details, the exact temperature drops in specific regions, the precise contribution of Tambora versus other factors, still carry uncertainty that honest historians and climate scientists acknowledge openly. What is not uncertain is this. Something reached into the sky above the northern hemisphere in 1816 and turned down the sun, and the world below felt every degree of it. In most places, the year began as years usually do, with people assuming that whatever winter they were living through would eventually give way to spring. Snow melts, rivers rise, fields dry. You wait, and then you plant. But in 1816, as the months turned, that familiar sequence started to slip. Across much of Europe and North America, the first hints came quietly. A lingering chill in March that felt a little sharper than usual. Patches of snow that clung to hedgerows and shaded slopes long after they should have vanished. Frost that kept forming on window panes even when the calendar said it was time for lambs and blossoms. In New England, farmers noted that the ground stayed hard longer than they remembered. Soil that should have been workable remained clumped and cold, refusing the plough. In parts of Britain and Ireland, spring rains came, but they seemed to fall through a colder air. People complained of raw days, of a damp that got into your bones and stayed there. None of that by itself was unheard of. Bad springs happen. The memory of a few harsh years tends to fade when the next decent season arrives. So in March and April, most people simply grumbled and waited. The real strangeness showed itself when spring refused to turn into summer. In the American Northeast, there were frosts in May that scorched tender shoots just as they appeared. A farmer in Vermont wrote of seeing the new corn blackened in a night. Another in New Hampshire complained that he had planted 3 times and still had almost nothing to show for it. In Quebec, there were reports of ice forming on puddles at a time when animals should have been grazing on fresh grass. June should have brought warmth and growth. Instead, many places got something closer to a second, crueler spring. In parts of New England, snow fell in June. Not just a flurry you could laugh about, but storms that left measurable depths on the ground. Reports from the time describe people waking up to find fields whitened and leaves sagging under the weight. One account from Maine speaks of birds dropping from the sky, killed by the sudden cold. In upstate New York and parts of Pennsylvania, there were repeated freezes. A farmer might look out at his small patch of corn on the evening of a mild day, feeling cautiously hopeful, and wake up to find it all limp and pale, the cells in the plants burst by ice crystals. In those regions, some households gave up on corn entirely and tried to plant hardier crops, only to see those cut down in turn. Europe had its own catalogue of anomalies. In Scotland and northern England, snow and sleet were recorded in late May and June. Alpine communities that were used to cool summers noticed something different. Snow lines that did not retreat as far up the mountains as they should, glaciers that seemed to hold their winter faces longer into the year. Across much of Central Europe, the defining feature was not snow, but rain. Relentless, persistent, soaking rain. In parts of what is now Germany, Switzerland and France, it seemed as if the sky simply forgot how to clear. Weeks of overcast skies blurred into each other, fields turned to mud. Seeds rotted in waterlogged furrows. Hay could not be cut or dried properly. There are diaries that talk about the sound of rain as a kind of background noise for an entire season, people beginning to dread the constant dripping from roofs and trees. The sun, when it did appear, often looked strange. Contemporary observers mentioned a pale or weak sunlight, a disk that could be stared at for longer than was comfortable in normal years. Colours at dawn and dusk were sometimes described as unusually vivid, with red and purple horizons. Most people did not connect these optical oddities to the cold and the failed crops, but they were all facets of the same altered atmosphere. What made this year so devastating was not that every day was freezing. It was the way small, persistent shifts undermined the fragile arithmetic of agriculture. Most crops that people depended on in 1816 needed a particular combination of things: soil, warm enough to trigger germination, a certain accumulation of heat over the season to bring plants to maturity, enough sunlight for photosynthesis, enough dry days for fieldwork and harvest. Tambora's veil in the stratosphere did not plunge the world into an ice age. It shaved off a few crucial degrees, trimmed the energy reaching fields by a few percent, altered circulation patterns in ways that changed where storms formed and lingered. That was enough. Imagine a field of newly emerged grain. It can tolerate a light chill, maybe even one mild frost. What it cannot survive is a hard freeze after its tissues have committed to growth. A night or two of temperatures just a little below freezing at the wrong moment can kill or stunt an entire planting. Even when plants survived, they often grew slowly in the colder soil, leaving them vulnerable to pests, disease, and later season weather shocks. The same logic held at the other end of the cycle. Grain needs a stretch of reasonably dry weather to ripen and be brought in. In much of Europe, those weeks of drizzle and downpour flattened stalks and encouraged mould. In North America, a sequence of cold snaps interrupted the process of ripening entirely. In both places, it was as if the year were constantly snatching food away just as it was about to become secure. It is important, though, not to imagine the entire Northern Hemisphere experiencing the same misery in lockstep. The crisis was patchwork. Some regions fared relatively well. Parts of southern Europe had better harvests, or at least less catastrophic ones, buffered by warmer baseline climates. Certain valleys, protected from the cold winds or blessed with particular microclimates, produced enough that their inhabitants later remembered 1816 as difficult but survivable rather than apocalyptic. In North America, areas farther south or with more diverse crops sometimes managed to scrape through with marginal yields. Other places took the full force of the anomaly, high latitudes, elevated lands, regions already living close to subsistence. In those zones, people saw crop after crop fail, pastures stay bare, and prices begin to rise. For them, the idea of a year without a summer was less a poetic phrase than a literal description. Months in which the kind of heat you count on to grow food simply never arrived. When historians and climate scientists today try to reconstruct exactly how cold it was, how cloudy, how wet, they face a different kind of problem. There were no satellites watching the planet in 1816. Weather stations were few, scattered, and not always standardized. Thermometers existed, but not in every village, and not always in the hands of people inclined to keep meticulous records. So we piece it together from fragments, from the diaries of farmers who noted frosts and snowfalls in the margins of their accounts, from letters that mention unseasonable cold or ruinous rain, from newspapers that reported on rivers flooding, on ice forming in unexpected months, on ships delayed by storms, from church registers that included remarks about failed harvests alongside births and deaths. Beyond written records, there are the physical traces. Tree rings that thickened or thinned depending on growth conditions, lake sediments that preserve pollen from plants that flourished or struggled, modern climate models that take what we know about Tambora's sulfur cloud and simulate its likely impact on temperatures and rainfall patterns. No single piece of evidence tells the whole story. Taken together, they outline a year in which the usual boundaries between seasons blurred and broke. A year when the machinery of climate, nudged by a distant volcano, produced a pattern of cold, cloud, and rain that reached into the lives of people who had never heard the name Tambora, and would never know exactly why their fields would not behave the way their parents had promised they would. For most rural families in 1816, the disaster did not arrive all at once. It crept in through the fields. You can imagine a small farm in New England or in the uplands of Germany, a family that has done what they always do. Hitched the horses or oxen as soon as the soil was barely workable, turned the furrows, dropped seed into the earth with the same gestures their parents taught them, covered it over, and trusted the season to do the rest. When the first planting failed, many people did not panic. Seed can rot in a wet spring. A late frost can nip new growth. These things happen. So they dug up what they could, or simply turned the ruined vegetation back into the soil and planted again. In parts of New England, that second sowing went into ground that was still too cold. Corn and beans sat listless. Some seeds never sprouted at all. Others poked through the surface only to meet another cold wave. June frosts in Vermont and New Hampshire blackened whole fields that had already been replanted once. There are accounts of farmers driving into town with wagons full of withered stalks to show the extent of the damage, hoping for credit or help. In Central Europe, the pattern was different but no kinder. In low-lying meadows and valley bottoms, grain should have shot up thick and green. Instead, constant rain turned furrows into shallow trenches of standing water. Seed grains swelled, cracked, and rotted underground. Farmers sometimes dug into their fields with spades and found not sprouting plants, but a sour, rotting mass that smelled more like a compost heap than the beginning of a harvest. By midsummer, many families were in an impossible position. They had already used more seed than usual trying to replant. Seed was not an abstract commodity you reordered. It was part of last year's harvest, set aside instead of eaten. To plant it again, and lose it again, was to watch your future food disappear into the mud. Early 19th century agriculture was acutely sensitive to time. Most staple crops in temperate regions needed a certain number of warm days to move through their stages of growth: germination, tillering, heading, ripening. When cold and cloud shaved weeks off the practical growing season, there was no slack in the system. If you planted late and the summer never truly warmed, the grain simply would not mature. Ears stayed small and half-filled. Kernels remained soft and green when they should have hardened to storable seed. In some places, people cut their grain early, at poor ripeness, because leaving it any longer in the constant damp meant losing it entirely to sprouting or mould. Hay was another quiet catastrophe. In mixed farming systems across Europe and North America, Hay from meadows and field margins was what kept animals alive through winter. You needed a spell of dry, breezy weather to cut the grass, let it wilt, turn it, and bring it in before it spoiled. In 1816, that sequence kept breaking. Rain fell just after cutting. Windless, grey days refused to draw the moisture out. Mown grass lay on the ground too long, turning black and slimy instead of crisp and sweet. Some farmers tried again and again, cutting small sections whenever the sky looked briefly promising, only to see another shower move through and ruin the work. Poor hay harvests landed like a delayed blow. Even in places where some grain survived, people were already looking ahead to winter and seeing an empty loft where stacks of fodder should have been. Cattle and horses that ought to have gone into the cold season well fed and strong would start it thin. Many would not see spring. Those animals were more than just food on the hoof. In a world before tractors and lorries, they were engines. Oxen pulled ploughs, horses hauled carts of grain to town, timber to sawmills, coal to cities. Mail coaches and stage wagons, the arteries of early 19th century communication and commerce, depended on teams of horses stabled along the routes. So when hay was scarce and grain for animals had to compete with grain for people, choices became stark. In some districts, livestock were slaughtered early because there would be no fodder to carry them. That meant a short-term glut of meat, followed by a long-term loss of traction and transport power. In other places, draft animals were kept alive but underfed, their strength dwindling just when they were most needed to work the heavy, wet soils of the next season. The vulnerability ran deeper than any single farm. Most rural communities in 1816 still relied overwhelmingly on their own surrounding fields and pastures to feed themselves. There were markets, of course, and some trade in grain between regions, but bulk transport was slow and expensive. A bad harvest in one valley could not easily or cheaply be offset by surplus from another hundreds of miles away. When a single season collapsed across wide areas at once, that local dependence became a trap. Village granaries held only so much. Parish poor funds could stretch to buying some imported flour or grain, but not enough for everyone, and not indefinitely. Even in countries with relatively sophisticated trading networks like Britain, the ability to move large quantities of food from one port to the interior was constrained by canals, roads, and the availability of feed for the animals that pulled the barges and wagons. As reports of failed fields accumulated, grain prices began to climb. Bakers and merchants watched the markets anxiously, reading newspaper columns and letters from ports. Ordinary people watched the price of bread in a more direct way, day by day at the stall or bakery, where the same coin bought less and less. In diaries and local chronicles from 1816 and 1817, you can see the tone shift. Early entries note bad weather and disappointing crops with a kind of resigned irritation. Later ones speak of distress, of universal anxiety, of people counting sacks in their lofts and realizing that what they had assumed would be enough until next harvest now looked thin. Bread, which in many households formed the bulk of daily calories, became an object of constant calculation. How thick to cut the slices, how much to mix with potatoes or other fillers, whether to sell a pig or a piece of land to buy another month's supply of grain. Parents skipping meals so that children could eat. All of that can be traced back, step by step, to those stubborn fields, to seeds that never sprouted or sprouted too late, to hay that turned black in the rain, to the narrow margin between a normal year and one in which the balance of temperature, sunlight, and time slipped just enough that the living fabric of rural economies began to unravel. In the countryside, hunger first appears as a missing sack in the loft, an empty stall where an animal used to stand. In the towns and growing industrial cities of 1816 and 1817, it shows up in a different form. As numbers on a board, coins on a counter, crowds in the streets. Imagine walking into a market square in a small European town that autumn. On one side, a few grain dealers, their wagons lighter than usual. On the other, bakers with loaves behind their counters, smaller than last year and pricier. People gather early, hoping to buy before supplies run out. They watch the chalk marks that record the daily price. The merchant lifts his hand, hesitates, then writes a number higher than yesterday. You can almost feel the murmur move through the crowd. Not a dramatic cry, just a tightening. Someone does the quick mental arithmetic and realizes that their week's wages will now buy a day or two less of bread. A mother turns away from the stall, clutching her coin, trying to decide whether to buy now at this higher price or wait and hope it comes down. This is how scarcity turns into inflation, and inflation turns into fear. Merchants facing shorter supplies and nervy creditors are not always villains in this story. Many of them are simply trying not to go under. They hear the same rumours as everyone else, of failed grain in distant provinces, of flooded roads blocking shipments, of governments considering export bans. If they sell everything today at a low price and the next shipment never comes, they will have nothing to offer, and no money left to buy more, even if it is available. So some begin to hold back stock, not necessarily mountains of grain in hidden warehouses, more often a few extra sacks set aside for later. They tell themselves they are smoothing out supply, preventing a sudden total shortage. But from the street, it looks different. People see wagons arriving at dawn and leaving the merchant's yard less full at midday. They notice that flour is technically available, but only in small, expensive amounts. The word hoarding starts to circulate. In this atmosphere, rumour is as powerful as weather. A whisper that a neighbouring town has forbidden grain to leave its boundaries. A story that a barge full of wheat was seized upstream. A report that the government is about to set a maximum price, so sellers will stop selling altogether. Each rumour pushes people to buy now, as much as they can. That sudden surge of demand, colliding with already limited supply, drives prices up further. The market becomes less a place of routine exchange and more a stage where panic quietly rehearses its lines. For labourers and artisans, the squeeze is immediate. Their income is fixed or only slowly adjustable. A weaver in a German town, a spinner in a Lancashire mill, a mason in a Swiss city, they are paid in coins that once fed a family modestly. Now, week by week, those same coins buy fewer loaves, less meat, no extras at all. Some take extra work if they can find it, but the same bad harvest that has raised food prices has also slowed construction, textile orders, and other trades. Employers cut hours. Wages fall or stagnate just as bread costs rise. Peasants who have come into town to sell vegetables or eggs find that their small surpluses are no longer enough to cover what they must buy. Salt, tools, a little flour to make up for their own failed grain. The line between self-sufficiency and dependence on the market, always thin, disappears. They are suddenly competing at the same stalls as city dwellers who have no land at all. For the urban poor, those already close to the edge before the strange cold year, there is often no buffer. The tiny savings hidden in a box are spent quickly. Household objects trickle into pawn shops, a coat, a pot, a piece of furniture. When that avenue closes, people turn to other strategies. Begging becomes more visible. People at church doors, outside bakeries, along main roads leading into town. In some places, authorities note a rising number of vagrants, families on the move, searching for cheaper bread, or for parishes, rumoured to be more generous with relief. Tension focuses on bread because bread is visible and regulated. It has weight, price, and tradition behind it. In many European cities, there are still old expectations that authorities will ensure an adequate supply of grain, especially in crisis years. When that expectation is disappointed, anger has a clear target. Bread riots are not mindless explosions. They often follow an internal logic. A crowd gathers outside a bakery or grain warehouse, sometimes after word spreads that a merchant is exporting grain while locals go hungry, or that loaves have shrunk while prices have risen. Women are prominent in these gatherings, household managers who feel the pressure of the cooking pot most directly. The crowd might seize a cart of flour on its way out of town, force the driver to turn back, and then insist that the grain be sold locally at what they declare a just price. Sometimes they pay, but at the lower price they believe is fair. In their own eyes, they are not stealing. They are enforcing a moral economy against a market that has become unmoored from community norms. Authorities see something different. Disorder, challenge to property rights, the first hint that hunger could turn into political unrest. Soldiers or militia are called out. In some places, magistrates try to calm things by promising investigations into hoarding or by arranging emergency grain imports. In others, they respond with arrests, public floggings, even executions to make an example, and discourage further riots. Governments are under multiple contradictory pressures. On one hand, there is fear of revolution. The Napoleonic Wars have only just ended. Armies have demobilized hundreds of thousands of men. National debts are enormous. In Britain, for instance, industrial workers and political reformers are already agitating against the Corn Laws, which restrict the import of cheaper foreign grain to protect domestic producers. In parts of Central Europe and Italy, conservative regimes worry that any concession could be read as weakness, emboldening liberals and nationalists. On the other hand, rulers know that letting hunger run unchecked can be more dangerous than intervening. So we see a patchwork of responses. Some states or municipalities release grain from public granaries, selling it below market price. Others subsidize bread for the poorest, or authorize soup kitchens and public works projects, paying the hungry to build roads or drain marshes so they can buy their own food. In places with more centralized administrations, officials experiment with price controls, setting maximums for bread and grain. These measures can offer short-term relief, but also carry risks. If bakers cannot cover their costs, they bake less or switch to lower-quality ingredients. In a few regions, export bans are imposed, forbidding grain from leaving the district until local needs are met. That protects one town's consumers while potentially starving another. Every decision shifts the burden from one group to another. Cheap government grain helps urban workers, but angers farmers who see their produce undercut. Crackdowns on profiteers reassure the crowd, but worry merchants whose cooperation is needed to bring in future supplies. Allowing prices to float freely satisfies economic theorists and some landowners, but leaves a growing mass of people unable to afford the essentials of life. In the letters and proclamations of the time, you can sense how officials struggle to find language for what is happening. Some blame the weather and speak of visitations of providence. Others point to speculation and monopolists, or to the supposed laziness and improvidence of the poor. Political opponents use the crisis to attack whichever faction is in power. Conservatives accuse liberals of undermining social order. Liberals accuse conservatives of clinging to old privileges while people starve. And underneath all of that, in the markets and alleys and tenement rooms, daily life narrows to a few hard calculations. How long can you make a loaf last? Do you risk joining a crowd at the bakery, knowing soldiers might appear? Do you sell your tools to buy food now, knowing that without tools you cannot earn later? Do you stay in a town where work is drying up and bread is dear, or join the flow of people on the roads, hoping that somewhere else will be kinder? Those movements of carts half-loaded, of crowds around wagons, of families setting out on foot, are the next thread in the story. Scarcity does not sit still. It pushes people to move, and in the winter that followed the summer that never came, roads and ports across the Atlantic world began to feel that pressure. By early winter, those roads are lined with people who, a year earlier, might never have imagined leaving home. Some families move only a few miles. A tenant in Western Ireland facing a failed potato plot and a landlord who will not lower the rent sends one son inland to look for work on an estate rumoured to be hiring. A Swiss herdsman leads his thin cattle down from the high pastures earlier than usual, hoping that lower villages still have hay for sale. In the German states, whole households drift from village to village, following word that rye is cheaper 2 valleys over, or that a particular parish is generous with bread tickets. Others make more drastic choices. Selling a cow that has been in the family for years to pay for passage to a city. Pawning the last decent piece of furniture to buy flour and boots for the road. Once these anchors are gone, returning becomes more difficult. Mobility, forced by hunger, begins to reshape communities. The pattern is similar in many parts of Europe. Grain-poor regions bleed people toward grain-rich ones. Mountain districts see more traffic toward river valleys. Towns with mills and early factories attract the desperate with the promise of wages that may or may not materialize. In some places, local officials quietly encourage this outflow, hoping fewer mouths will ease the pressure. In others, they try to push people back, issuing passes, restricting entry, or warning that their poor funds cannot support newcomers. Across the Atlantic, the effects are less about people crossing oceans immediately and more about a change in how people think about them. The United States and Canada have their own bad harvests and hard winters, especially in New England and the maritime provinces, where the strange cold destroys crops and even freezes rivers later than usual. But there is still land, forests to be cleared, prairies to be broken. In letters written home to Europe, relatives describe hardship, yes, but also opportunity, wages in ports, open farms in the interior. In some New England towns, ruined by crop failure 2 years in a row, families look westward, toward Ohio and beyond, as a kind of internal migration frontier. The immediate crisis does not trigger the largest waves of transatlantic migration. That surge will come later in the century. But it plants and waters the idea that safety might lie elsewhere, if not for you, then for your children. Hunger teaches people that climate and soil are not fixed blessings. They can fail you. Once that lesson sinks in, the very notion of seeking a better climate gains new weight. On the road, bodies wear down quickly. A diet narrowed to bread and a little weak soup leaves people vulnerable. Proteins and fats disappear from the table first. Vegetables, when they can be had at all, are often wilted, mouldy, or used to stretch flour into something that passes for a meal. Children stop growing. Wounds heal more slowly. Cold penetrates deeper. In this weakened state, old familiar diseases return with new force. Typhus, carried by lice, thrives in crowded lodging houses, barns, and improvised shelters where migrants sleep pressed together for warmth. Dysentery follows bad water and contaminated food, barrels of grain that have started to rot, meat that has hung too long in a cold that is not quite cold enough to preserve it. Fevers spread through prisons and workhouses where the poor, the displaced, and the unlucky find themselves crammed together. There are statistics, of course, parish registers showing a spike in burials in 1817, reports from hospitals in Vienna or Paris noting an unusual number of fever cases. Later, historians will connect some of these outbreaks to what appears to have been the first great cholera pandemic, moving slowly out of South Asia and into the wider world. But the numbers are patchy and uneven, like the weather itself. In many rural places, no one is counting carefully. A child dies on the road. An old woman is buried without a record. A labourer collapses in a field and is remembered only in a line in a local chronicle, if that. What we can say is that famine rarely kills directly by simple lack of calories. It kills by lowering defences until other forces, always present, can do more damage. This is why two neighbouring districts can experience the same miserable summer and emerge with very different levels of loss. One has a functioning system of parish relief, a network of kin who can take in cousins and nephews, a tradition of monasteries or religious brotherhoods distributing soup and bread. Another has less of that social padding, and its people fall more quickly. Charity in this period is a mixture of compassion and calculation. Churches organise collections for the poor of their own parish first, then sometimes for distant regions whose suffering has become dramatic enough to reach the newspapers. Wealthier landowners, aware that hungry labourers can become dangerous, might open granaries for sale at cost, or authorise the slaughter of some livestock to be distributed in small portions. Urban guilds and confraternities set up soup kitchens. The soups are often thin, more water than anything else, but even so, they can make the difference between collapse and the ability to keep walking, keep working. Kinship networks stretch to accommodate the strain. A cousin in town takes in rural relatives, crowding 3 families into 2 rooms. Grandparents share what little they have with grandchildren sent from the countryside just for the winter. These arrangements are not always gentle. Resentments simmer. But they are part of the invisible architecture of survival. At the micro level, improvisation flourishes. People experiment with foods they would once have rejected. In some German regions, hunger bread appears, loaves bulked out with potato peelings, bran, even ground straw. In Scotland, families boil nettles, sorrel, and whatever green plants they can find. Some of these experiments become permanent changes, Wider acceptance of the potato, for instance, as a staple rather than a suspicious novelty. Others are quickly abandoned when better times return, remembered only as symbols of degradation. Through it all, the toll is highly uneven. Some towns manage to keep their death rates only slightly above normal. Others lose a noticeable fraction of their people. The very poorest suffer first, and most, but not exclusively. A smallholder with a bit of land can be ruined by having to sell it at the wrong moment. A craftsman with no savings can see decades of careful work erased in a season. When we look back, we see traces, spikes in mortality graphs, clusters of emigrants leaving certain districts in subsequent decades, notes in diaries about the hard years. What we do not see are all the near misses, the illness survived, the piece of bread shared, the last-minute decision to move that kept a family just ahead of disaster. Those stories, mostly unrecorded, are the quiet counterpart to the dramatic images of dark skies and failed harvests. They are the small, stubborn acts of adaptation that allowed most people somehow to make it through and to wonder, afterwards, what it had all meant. In the middle of it, of course, almost no one thought in terms of volcanic aerosols or global climate perturbations. They thought in terms they already understood. In a stone church in a French village, the priest looks out at a congregation thinner than the year before, faces sharper with hunger. The candles gutter in the chill air. Even in July, the building never seems to warm properly. In his sermon, he reaches for familiar language: trials, chastisement, the sins of the age. He quotes stories his own teachers emphasized during earlier hard years, how drought or frost in the Bible was sometimes read as a call to repentance. He does not say that God has sent this particular weather in anger at this particular village. That would feel presumptuous. But he suggests that patience, prayer, and moral reform are the proper response. People file out afterward, and their private interpretations diverge. One woman, who has just buried a child, finds comfort in the idea that the suffering is not random. Another, whose husband drinks away what little they have, hears the words about sin and thinks not of herself, but of him. A third listens skeptically, having read in a Paris paper that similar strange weather has been reported in England, in Italy, even in America. Surely God would not be angry at everyone at once, she thinks. Or if he is, what can any one person do? The newspapers themselves are a chorus of confusion and theory. Editors in London and Boston print letters from readers describing frosts in June, snow in places that rarely see it, harvests blighted across wide regions. Some attribute it to unusual spots on the sun, which have indeed been noticed through crude telescopes. Others blame a shift in winds or the recent war. The long years of conflict with Napoleon, with their cannons and campfires and masses of men on the move, loom large in recent memory. It is not such a leap to a mind shaped by that experience to imagine that war has somehow disturbed the air itself. In university towns, a small number of natural philosophers are beginning to think systematically about climate and weather, but their tools are still rudimentary. Barometers, thermometers, scattered records of rainfall and frost dates. They can observe that something is happening, a cluster of cold summers, odd storms, perhaps a dimming of the sun on certain days, but they cannot trace its true origin. Tambora, a mountain in a remote part of what Europeans call the East Indies, has blown itself apart more than a year earlier. Sailors who pass through that region tell stories of ash falling like black snow, of skies so dark at noon that ship lanterns had to be lit. Those tales make their way into shipping reports, then into the margins of learned journals. But the leap from a distant eruption to dim harvests in Bavaria or New Hampshire is one almost no one can yet make with confidence. Closer to the ground, people reach for smaller, more local explanations. A Swiss farmer blames the recent cutting of a nearby forest, convinced that the loss of trees has somehow let in the cold. A New England minister wonders, half aloud, whether the infidelity and new political radicalism of the post-revolutionary period have invited divine displeasure. In Scottish Highland villages, old stories about bad years are revived. Tales of witches raising storms, of second sight warning, of cattle murrain and blighted fields. Enlightenment has not fully erased older beliefs. In some remote places, it has barely touched them. When the normal patterns fail, those older frameworks feel newly relevant. Officials, for their part, are often cautious in what they say. A Prussian bureaucrat drafting a memorandum about grain shortages notes unseasonable weather as a contributing factor, but focuses on transport bottlenecks and price speculation, things a government might plausibly influence. An Austrian provincial governor writes to Vienna suggesting that rumours of divine wrath are making people restless, and that public proclamations emphasising order, patience, and the empire's benevolence might calm them. He does not pretend to know why the wheat will not ripen. His job is to manage the consequences, not to interpret the skies. Through all of this runs a deeper unease, the feeling of living inside a mystery that will not resolve. If there were a clear cause, even a frightening one, people could orient themselves to it. A plague, at least, announces itself with symptoms. A war has fronts and dates. This, instead, is a vaguer enemy, a cold that arrives late, retreats briefly, then returns, rains that seem promising and then destroy, days that never quite brighten. It is like being ill without a diagnosis. Every theory competes with every other, and none can be conclusively proved. In taverns and at market stalls, conversations loop back to the same questions. Is this the beginning of something larger, a new, harsher age, or a passing trial that will be remembered like other bad years? Has the world itself changed, or only people's luck? Some cling fiercely to the idea that things will go back to how they were, because the alternative, a climate that can shift unpredictably on a scale no one can control, feels unbearable. Decades later, when scientists piece together ice cores and tree rings and old observatory notes, Tambora will emerge as the hidden engine behind that shadowed summer. But in 1816 and 1817, for those actually living through it, the volcano might as well be on another planet. What they have instead are sermons, rumours, editorials, and private theories, and the daily work of survival carried out under a sky whose intentions no one can quite read. In the moment, most people are too busy coping to notice that they are also becoming historians, that their letters, their sketches of strange skies, their complaints about ruined trips and failed crops will someday be read as evidence of a world briefly tilted out of its familiar orbit. But 1816 leaves a paper trail of unease. In a quiet parlour in Leipzig, a young man sits at a small desk, ink thickening in the well as he hesitates between sentences. He has already written the necessary news to his brother, prices, rumours about next year's conscription, the health of their parents. Then, almost as an afterthought, he adds a line that has appeared in thousands of letters that year. The weather remains most extraordinary. He describes with a kind of resigned disbelief a June that feels like October, a sun that seems veiled, a garden that refuses to flourish. He does not intend to write literature. He is simply trying to make sense of his days. Yet when you read his words now, the emotional undertone is unmistakable, a sense of living under a dimmer switch no one can find. Elsewhere, people who do intend to write literature also find their pens redirected by the weather. On the shore of Lake Geneva, the rain does not stop. Days of cloud roll over the Alps, white fronts piling on grey, the lake's surface dull and pewter. The year before, Europe's most celebrated poets had dreamed of sunny excursions, clear views across snowfields, long walks by the water. Instead, in the summer of 1816, they are mostly indoors. At the Villa Diodati, a rented house above the lake, a small group paces restlessly from room to room. Lord Byron, exiled by scandal, listens to the endless drumming of rain on shutters. Percy Bysshe Shelley reads aloud from volumes of German ghost stories. Mary Godwin, soon to be Mary Shelley, is only 18, watchful and inward, absorbing the mood of the house. Their days are punctuated by flashes of lightning that seem brighter for the dark they cut through, by low thunder rumbling over the lake. They talk about superstition and science, about electricity and the possibility of reanimating dead tissue. Outside, the world feels uncanny. Inside, that uncanniness condenses into stories. When Byron suggests that each member of the party write a ghost tale, the challenge is partly a way to fill long, cold evenings. But the tale Mary eventually produces is more than a fireside amusement. She imagines a young scientist who tries to seize godlike power over life and who unleashes something he cannot control. The creature in her story wanders through alpine landscapes that look very much like the ones outside the villa windows. Glaciers, storms, harsh, indifferent nature. Frankenstein, when it appears in print 2 years later, will carry traces of that sodden, strange summer on every page. The novel is not about the weather exactly, but it is suffused with the sense that nature can turn suddenly hostile, that human ambition is small against forces it barely understands. Elsewhere in Europe, painters turn their eyes to sunsets that seem newly dramatic. There are reports, later echoed by scientists studying atmospheric optics, of evenings when the sky burns with unusual purples and coppery reds, as if lit from behind by some unseen fire. Artists try to capture these colours, not knowing that the fine veil of volcanic particles high in the atmosphere is bending and scattering the light. In England, J.M.W. Turner will become famous in part for luminous, almost unreal skies painted in the following decades. Some scholars have wondered whether his sensibility was sharpened by the memory of those altered heavens in his youth, though the link can never be proved. In private diaries, the tone is more prosaic, but no less revealing. A New England farmer notes frost ruining his corn in June, then again in August. This year will not soon be forgot, he writes, not because he intends to contribute to history, but because the abnormal has driven itself into his sense of what time should feel like. In parts of Ireland, people later refer back to the year of the little harvest, a phrase that compresses both meteorology and hunger into 4 words. In Switzerland, some mountain communities simply call it the bad summer, and stories are told decades later of cattle driven high too early, of families forced to sell heirlooms for imported grain. Memory is not evenly distributed. In regions that scrape through with only moderate hardship, 1816 becomes one more odd year in a vague mental list of cold summers and dear times. In places where famine bites deep, certain Swiss valleys, parts of southwest Germany, stretches of rural New England, patches of Ireland, the year acquires sharper edges. Parents recall the thin faces of their children, the taste of bread stretched with ground bark or mashed potatoes, the particular hollow feeling of seeing fields that should be green still bare and brown. These localized memories help steer later decisions. In the northeastern United States, where repeated frosts convince many that the climate may simply be unreliable for certain crops, thousands of families look westward. Land along the Ohio and in what will become the Midwest has been opening up, first through violent dispossession of indigenous nations, then through federal land policies. The cold summer, followed by a few more poor years, nudges hesitant farmers to move. They load possessions onto wagons and follow newly cut roads toward what they hope will be more forgiving soil. In their letters back home, they sometimes refer explicitly to 1816 as the turning point, the year they decided that the seasons here can no longer be trusted. European farmers adapt in subtler ways. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, there is a slow shift toward planting hardier grains and potatoes, away from more delicate crops. Landlords fund drainage improvements to cope with waterlogged fields, or invest in small granaries to store surplus in good years, remembering too vividly how thin the margin had been. Some governments quietly encourage potato cultivation, aware that this tuber, still suspicious to many, has carried families through when wheat failed. None of these changes can be traced to Tambora on a government ledger. They appear instead as practical responses to recent bad seasons. But when you step back, a pattern emerges, a massive volcanic eruption, filtered through weather, through hunger, through choices on individual farms. By the time scientists in the late 19th and 20th centuries start to reconstruct the chain of cause and effect, the people who lived through 1816 are long gone. What remains are their artifacts of bewilderment, weather diaries, paintings of lurid sunsets, poems about dark days, migration records that jump in the years after the failed summer. Looking at them together, a lesson comes into focus. Even before factories blackened urban skies, before railroads and telegraphs and coal consumption bound continents in tighter loops, climate and society were already braided. A blast from a remote mountain could dim the light over Geneva, alter the childhood of a future novelist, push a Vermont farmer toward Ohio, shift planting habits in a Bavarian valley. No one, in 1816, could see that whole web. They felt only their own small strand trembling, but in their art and letters and memories, they left us a map of how sensitive human lives already were to the moods of the sky. A reminder that the boundary between natural event and social crisis is thinner than it looks, and that a year when summer never quite arrives can echo for generations in both the stories people tell and the places they choose to call home. When you trace those trembling strands backward, they lead to a single mountain on a distant Indonesian island, blowing itself apart in April 1815. Ash and sulphur rise into the stratosphere, drift on high winds, wrap the globe in a thin, invisible film. Sunlight is scattered, seasons are nudged off balance. Fields in Europe and North America falter, prices soar, crowds gather angrily in markets, and quiet decisions to leave or adapt accumulate in their shadow. Most people never learn the true cause. They endure, improvise, remember the bad year, then go on. If you've drifted this far with me, you can gently help this story travel a little farther too. If you'd like to hear more slow, detailed histories, you can subscribe so the next one finds you when you're ready to sleep. If anything in this tale stayed with you, the strange skies, the empty fields, the letters home, you can tap like or leave a comment so others can see which parts lingered. And if you feel awake enough, you might add one more small note to this long record of human weather. Tell us softly where you're listening from and what the sky looks like there tonight.